The hidden power of boredom, the illusion of productivity. What if the reason you feel creatively stuck, mentally exhausted, and unable to produce something truly original is not because of your lack of intelligence or discipline or capability, but there is something in mind which is consistently occupied, stimulated, and externally directed that it has forgotten how to sit with itself long enough to generate something that actually belongs to you. We are living in a time where doing nothing has quietly become the one of the most uncomfortable experiences of human mind. Not because it is inherently difficult, but because we have conditioned ourselves to believe that every moment must be filled with some form of productivity, input, or visible progress, as if stillness itself is a sign of failure. And in that constant need to stay engaged, to keep consuming, to keep updating ourselves with more information, more perspectives, and more tools. We have unknowingly trained our brains to react continuously without even allowing themselves to space to reflect, absorb, and create. So, how did it started? I would say this is a provocation. There is something which is deeply uncomfortable that is needed to be said here, may change the way you currently define growth, learning, and productivity. Your constant effort to remain productive, to stay ahead, to use every single tool, and to optimize every moment of your time, which not necessarily helping you becoming more creative or more original. In many ways, it is doing the exact opposite by crowding your mental space to such an extent that there is no room left for your own thoughts to emerge. When your mind is always occupied with consuming what others have created, suggested, or generated, even through advanced tools and intelligent systems, you begin to lose the access to your own internal voice because it is constantly being overridden by external input that feels urgent, relevant, and necessary. And over time, this doesn't not only reduce the creativity, it also creates dependency. When thinking become replaced by responding, originality become replaced by recombination of what you have already consumed. Usually, we are calling this in these scenarios as neural burnout or crisis. What we are witnessing today is not a simple burnout from work or simple burnout from decision making. It's a neural burnout. We are not talking about a traditional sense of overwork, but a very subtle and pervasive kind of thing, a form of neural fatigue that is emerging from the sheer volume of information, stimuli, and decision making that the brain is forced to process every single day without adequate recovery. This is what we can understand as cognitive debt. When your brain accumulates unfinished processing loops, ideas that were introduced but never integrated, thoughts that were triggered but never completed, information that was consumed but never meaningfully understood. Over time, this creates a kind of internal congestion where your mind is not empty but overloaded, not inactive, but inefficient, not incapable, but simply overwhelmed to a point where it begins to slow down as protective mechanism. So when you say I can't think clearly or I'm not getting any new ideas, What you are actually experiencing is not the lack of creativity, but a biological response designed to prevent total system exhaustion. It's almost similar to an exhausted day where you just want to sleep and don't want to think anything. Sometimes it does happen when a sudden traumatic situation comes to you and you are not able to deal with it. You will say, I don't have a capacity to think. I just want to go to sleep. Or probably do something which is not at all related to the topic. And this brings us to a realization as well that may completely change how you interpret your own behavior, especially in the moments where you feel unproductive, distracted, and disengaged. What if those moments are not the sign of your laziness, but the signs of your brain asking for something it hasn't received in a very long time? It might be asking for a space, silence, and the freedom to process without interruption. The major challenge in absorbing the information from different sources of internet is the information is very fast, but our brain have a capacity to process it. We can get 30 days schedule within few seconds, but to understand, to absorb and make a meaning out of it is a part of our brain. If we talk about any tool like ChatGPT, for example, ChatGPT is basically one of the conversational AI tool which provides a data related to the context. However, the way how it is presented to you is relational to your pattern of the way how you want to perceive or how you perceive the information or respond to the AI. It gives it back to you. It feels like perspective, which is not a perspective. It is just a simple variety of information given. And I'm not saying this. This is one of the conversations when I had been researching on Chat GPT and other conversational AI. What do they understand about perspective? How do they get to know the way how we want the answer? Why do we feel satisfied? And that was exactly it. So we try to get engaged more and more to the AIs to get more information, some junk because that was not needed at all. But we got over information and we feel like, oh my God, so much information we have. However, what is being restricted is the processing inside our brain. So the exposure is very high, but the processing inside our brain does need some time. So the information overloading causes a boredom because now within few seconds you have got the information. This is an assumption usually people make that now I am done with my work and now I don't have to do anything. But the problem is the information consumption is like a solid block, which is to be sliced and unlayered for everything, whatever you want to do. But very few of us usually do that. We just dumped the idea from one place to another, and that's it. That is the challenge where we find ourselves not thinking clearly. And maybe few years ago we were able to speak about something, but now it becomes such a difficult task for us because we have not processed the information for a very long time. And we were totally dependent on the information which was reflecting back to us by internet itself. So we have not given a thought to process the information or connections between the different kind of data or informations. Is it wrong? No. But to align your speed with the brain is something which is required to be done. And for that, we need some space, a place of silence, and a freedom to process without interruption, which is intentional pause, which is not doing anything. We are still to learn how to do this nothing. But let's go forward and let us understand what happens when you do nothing. Let's call it neuroscience of boredom. When you intentionally step away from constant stimulation, and allow yourself to sit without input, your brain begins to shift into different modes of functioning. One that is not focused on completing the task or reacting to the external world, but on internally organizing, connecting, and making sense of everything it has already experienced. So this state often refers to as an default mode network. That is where your mind becomes linear, more associative to the meaning. It starts to link the ideas, memories, and insights in the ways which are not immediately obvious but deeply meaningful. Listen to this again. Memories, insights are being linked to ideas, making associations that are not immediately obvious but deeply meaningful. It is in this state that your brain begins to think the kind of work that cannot be forced, cannot be rushed, or cannot be externally guided. It's your brain function. The work of creating something new from what already exists within you. And doing nothing helps it to be done. So, if we look at creativity as a sudden act of brilliance, it won't work. However, as a process, it becomes clear that it requires two equal important phases. One is intake of information from any source, and second is integration of that information into something that feels coherent, original, and personally meaningful. We keep assuming that as soon as we grab the information, our work of making the meaning is done. However, this is actually a longer uh, place of processing the information. Just imagine if I am speaking to you, there is a gap of few seconds in speaking. It used tone, vibe, energy, frequency in terms of the information received and perceived by your neurons. However, just imagine if something, instead of taking this much seconds, the information is fed to you in milliseconds. Now, the perseverance of your brain should have to work faster than what the information is being given to you. So, the capturing of data would not be that meaningful as compared to what actually it could have been. So, the intelligence would be improvised gradually. I'm not saying it could not be improvised, but it should be improvised gradually when we try to practice this processing in a better way. So probably by now you can get only single type of meaningful access to the same information. But gradually when you start practicing the pause or doing nothing and giving time to process the information you have collected, gradually it would reduce the time of your brain to process because now it has been a learned system. However, what most people doing today is overemphasizing the first phase while almost completely neglecting the second. This leads to a situation where brain is constantly receiving but rarely processing. And without processing, there is no synthesis, and without synthesis, there is no creativity, only accumulation. But why boredom? And why we avoid boredom? We do avoid boredom, right? So, despite the importance of this internal processing state, we tend to avoid it. Not because it lacks the value, but it lacks distraction. So, in absence of distraction, we are left alone with our thoughts, our emotions, and it is very uncomfortable. The silence does not only remove noise, it removes the escape. And for many people, that is far more challenging than staying busy. So, what to do? So take a moment to consider this, not as a theoretical idea, but a personal observation. When was the last time you allowed yourself to sit down without reaching for something, to fill in the silence, without trying to make the moment useful, or without expecting any immediate outcome? That space, how unfamiliar it may feel, is where your mind is beginning to return to itself, return to its own existence. Now, coming to the next part, how we can reclaim this silence by doing nothing. Easier way is to reframe doing nothing. How? We need to fundamentally shift how we understand the relationship between an activity and effectiveness. Because the assumption that constantly engaged the leads to become better in the outcomes is not only inaccurate but also harmful in the long run. Doing nothing is, when understood correctly, is not the absence of productivity but a critical phase within it. When the brain recovers, reorganizes, and strengthens the very neural path that allows you to think clearly and create meaningfully. So, like a physical growth, both effort and rest are required. Similarly, from now onwards, mental growth also requires stimulation and stillness. And removing either of these can disrupt the balance which is necessary for a sustainable performance. Now, coming to the tools or techniques which you can use. So, instead of adding more techniques or tools or framework to your routine, what you can do is you can introduce something very simple and more powerful. You can just take 5 minutes of your day, which is a deliberate pause, where you don't have to seek any input, you don't have to seek any output, neither you have to seek a validation on something what you are doing. You simply allow your mind to exist. There's no direction giving, no direction asked. Initially, it would be pretty uncomfortable, but while you start from 5, then 10, when you sit without your phone, without the music, without any structure activity, and just observe what happens as your thoughts begin to surface. What shifts, what eventually settles. Basically, you have to give it a freedom to recalibrate itself. When the thoughts are pretty uncomfortable, just write the keyword. If the keyword, if your thought is from a painful memory, write it down, painful memory. Then you start getting angry, you write anger or resentment, whatever the thought or the type of thought it is, just write it. Don't write the whole story of your thought. And that is small thing, that is small intention would make a lot of difference because your mind is processing the emotions behind the processed situations behind anything when you are just rushing towards an activity and it's need a break to think through and get out of the brain. So there is a breakthrough insight in this. The insight is something that often emerge from this practice. So whatever the ideas you are searching for externally, initially you have to list them down. Make a mind map of them, make the pointers out of them, and then think about them by yourself first. The difference would be when you start creating a structure in your own notebook or in your own graph or picture, whatever you are utilizing to express yourself, it would give you a direction to gather the information. So you can also limit and avoid yourself from overconsumption of information. So you can get 300 days information in a day in few seconds. But within 300 days, do you need all the details on the day one? Do you need all the details in day one, R1? No, right? So firstly, what you can do is you can systematically adjust the information and the source and work from your structure to the information gathering rather than information gathering and creating a structure. So, if you really want to create something that is original, meaningful, and reflective of who you are, and you must be willing to step away from constant noise, not as a withdrawal, but as an act of intention, then your mind, which is currently constantly occupied with the input, will also ready to receive the information. And eventually, it will learn how to generate information faster. But you have to make it practice so that your neural burnout would not be the difficult situation for you. So, finally, in the world which continuously demands your attention, your time, and your engagement, choosing silence, choosing a pause is not delaying the progress, but it is deliberately returning to only place where your true creativity begins. And you find yourself as a better, successful, and healthy person. Take care of yourself.